it's like jumping from the pot into the fire. Between 1954 and 1974, the 20 years following the infamous landmark Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, that 20 years from 54 to 74, Sister Frankie, America saw an explosion in private school and private school enrollment. That explosion in private school was the result of white parents taking their children out of the public school and putting them in private school because they didn't want them to be educated with black children. We have to keep in mind that one of the last institutions to desegregate in America, and we could argue, Sister Frankie, the institution that has still not desegregated in America, is education. To this very day, 85% of African American children learn exclusively amongst themselves without any white children there. So education has never desegregated in America. The military has desegregated, public transportation has desegregated, college has desegregated, public school has not. But getting back to my point, because white parents ran to the suburbs, Sister Frankie, to escape having to tolerate their children learning in the same classroom with black children, when the black parent puts their child in a suburban school or a private school, they don't understand that your child is more likely to be discriminated against. They're more likely to be referred for special ed, more likely to be referred for psychiatric medication because you're not supposed to be able to afford private school tuition or suburban public school mortgages. In other words, how did you even get out here? How can you afford to even live in this community? So that type of microaggression on the part of white folk will trigger a much harsher treatment in the suburb than what your child might have experienced in public school.
Yeah, let me say again, your thought of Brown versus Board of Education, it wasn't just a black vote.
I believe that the purpose of Brown versus Board of Education was to integrate public school, not for the benefit of black children, but for the ability of the American power structure to more effectively control what black children were being taught. In other words, the schools desegregated to dumb down the black child. Sister Frankie, we have to keep in mind, before we could go to school with white kids, we invented the gas mask. Before we could go to school with white kids, we invented the stoplight. Before we could go to school with white children, we invented the refrigerated truck. We invented the cell phone, the internet, the helicopter. The black child was inventing things in that segregated, dilapidated, one-room schoolhouse that white children were not even thinking about. So it was not a desegregation for better education. It was a desegregation in order to dumb down the intellectual brilliance of the black child.
But it was Justice Thurgood Marshall, a black man, that authored a lot of that legislation to be able to desegregate schools in Brown versus Board of Education.
And I support it. I believe the fight was a just one. I believe it was a fight that needed to happen. No different than Dr. King's fight for the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act. Here's the mistake that we made as a people. With both the 1954 Supreme Court decision and the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, Frankie, Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the real author of that fight, by the way, they never intended for every black child to be integrated into white public schools. Dr. King never intended for every black person to give up our independent institutions and businesses to go and live amongst white people. The purpose of these fights, Sister Frankie, was to tear down the barrier barrier of discrimination so those black children who needed to go to those schools could. And so those black people who needed to access those services could. The mistake that we made is we thought it meant all of us should go to public school. All of us should move to the white suburb. All of us should give up our independent black businesses and go integrate with white people. That was never the intent. The intent was only to give us access, nothing more.
In your book, when we talk about inner city schools, a lot of the boards of education are people of color. A lot of the educators are people of color. Superintendents are people of color. And some of the same things that you're talking about is people of color that are leading these districts. How do you address that? I've heard the term skin folk and kinfolk, but we're talking about if black folk looking out for black folk in districts that are highly populated with people of color, should not they be looking out for the best interests of children of color?
They should be looking out for the best interests of children of color, Sister Frankie. But we all know that in order for them to obtain those jobs and maintain those jobs, they have to look out for the best interests of the white power structure, the institution, not the children themselves. We have to understand racism is systemic. It is not individualistic anymore. That means what? The racism is in the laws. The racism is in the policies. The racism is in the culture of the school. The racism is actually in the decisions that the school boards make. The black principal, in all due respect, and I'm a former principal myself, Sister Frankie, you can't honestly call a black principal an educational leader. And the reason you cannot call a black principal an educational leader is because a leader has the ability to hold their followers accountable. The leader is given the power to transform the institution that they're responsible for leading. Black principals are not given that authority. Black principals are not given that power. If a black principal is trying to change education in their school to benefit their black students, Sister Frankie, if they upset the white teachers too much, if they upset the white female teachers under their supervision, those white female teachers will go behind their back, complain to the union will complain to the superintendent will complain to the school board, and that black principal can end up being switched out of that job or laid off altogether. The problem is you put black principals in a position where you don't really want them to make change. You only want them to manage the miseducation. See, education, Sister Frankie, is controlled by the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions are the most powerful unions in America. I can promise you right now, Sister Frankie, that Joe Biden will do absolutely nothing to improve education for our children. How can I say that? And he's only been president for a few weeks. The reason I can say that is because Joe Biden carried both of the major teacher unions during this past election. He carried the American Federation of Teachers. He carried the National Education Association. The job of the union is to protect their teachers, not protect our children. And since they voted for Joe Biden, and since they financed Joe Biden isn't going to do anything to make them accountable for the education of black children. If we want our children to learn, we have to teach them ourselves.
All right.